order. Without objection, the chair may declare the subcommittee in recess at any point. Today's hearing will examine the status and challenges of identity management in the United States, with a focus on the implementation of Real ID. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanedar, for the purposes of seeking unanimous consent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I ask unanimous consent that Mr. Foster be permitted to sit with the subcommittee and question today's witnesses, please.
So ordered. And I recognize myself for an opening statement. American identity management is fundamentally fractured. The Real ID Act of 2005 was passed in response to September 11th. The goal of the act was to address the fact that hijackers were able to fraudulently obtain states' driver's license and thereby enable their heinous acts of terrorism. Congress decided that there needed to be security standards for states when it came to identity documents. 18 years later, approximately 52% of the American population possess a driver's license that is Real ID compliant. That means 48% do not. Only 4 states require Real ID, which leaves 46 states and 5 American territories that provide non-Real IDs as an option. The problem comes to a head on May 7, 2025. On this date, if you do not have a Real ID, you will not be able to fly in the United States unless you happen to have a passport, a global entry card, or some other sort of government-issued ID that is approved for air travel. Suffice it to say that May 7, 2025, we're going to encounter utter mayhem at our airports. Since 2005, the Department of Homeland Security has awarded over $263 million in grant funding to assist in enhancements to driver's licenses. While this money has enabled individual states to update their processes, the Real ID efforts have come in behind schedule and over budget. While all states are now offering Real ID compliant licenses, there is more work to be done to raise awareness and Real ID adoption. Yesterday, I had the chance to meet with our Transportation Security Administration, which is now overseeing Real ID efforts given DHS headquarters mismanagement of this important initiative since the beginning. In 2020, TSA took over Real ID management, and Congress passed the Real ID Modernization Act, providing streamlined and innovative enhancements to Real ID requirements. Since then, the work has expanded and become somewhat more efficient. Furthermore, the TSA's identity management team has sought to look beyond physical identity documents and engage the digital realm, bringing together experts from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, technology companies, and banks to conceptualize the future of digital identity in the United States. I applaud these efforts, but I'm concerned that this is a bigger effort than just one agency and one department. It requires a whole of government approach and leadership from the highest levels. Sadly, every American knows somebody or has themselves been a victim of identity theft. This year alone, the Identity Theft Resource Center recorded more than 2,800 data breach notices, which include over 273 million individuals. Total financial losses for Americans is over $10 billion. The average cost for a U.S. driver's license on the black market is between $150 and $200. The average cost of a Social Security number is worth only a few pennies. In other words, Social Security numbers are easy to forge and not a very secure way to identify yourself. There's also a darker side to identity theft. The Identity Theft Resource Center reports that 16% of identity crime victims contemplated suicide the past year due to the impact of their stolen identity. Simply put, this issue is more than simply getting a driver's license. I firmly believe our current identity management challenges are solvable and provide us with an opportunity. However, it will require hard work. We need to fix the current problems by devaluing the stolen identity data of Americans that is already out in the open so that criminals cannot so easily leverage American identities for nefarious purposes. And we must take a hard look at how we can protect future American identity by providing new ways to prove that you are, in fact, who you say you are, such as new mobile driver's licenses that are digital counterpart to plastic ID cards and that can be used not only in person but also online. When it comes to the future of identity, Americans are rightly skeptical and concerned about privacy and civil liberties, especially the collection of biometric data. This is why in today's hearings we will draw the important distinction between biometric verification processes versus biometric recognition. As usual, the private sector has had solutions to identify management for decades, though because the government is the only authoritative issuer of identity, there are limitations on what the industry alone can deliver. We have with us today a panel of experts in the industry that have been involved in this discussion since the beginning of these discussions. The American people deserve a robust discussion about the timeline of events and how it is that we landed here, 18 years after the passage of the Real ID Act, with even greater challenges than we had before. I look forward to the discussion and the solutions that are offered. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar, for his opening statement.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for calling today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise. A record number of passengers are traveling through Transportation Security Administration security checkpoints with TSA, recently screening a record 2.9 million people in a single day. TSA is charged with verifying the identity of each and every passenger entering a checkpoint and ensuring each passenger receives the appropriate level of screening based on the risk that they pose. As TSA approaches the deadline for requiring passengers to show real ID compliant identification in May 2025, the agency must enhance public awareness efforts to ensure all passengers have compliant IDs. Our crowded aviation system cannot afford the chaos and the chaos of thousands of passengers arriving to TSA checkpoints without acceptable identification. Recently, TSA has begun piloting next-generation technologies for managing and verifying identities. In 8 states, passengers can now use mobile driver's licenses to access screening checkpoints. And in 25 locations, TSA is using facial recognition technology to match passengers to their IDs. Digital IDs and facial recognition technology both offer the potential for security enhancements and convenience, but the potential downsides are grave. TSA must prioritize protections for privacy, civil rights, civil liberties, and even to an extreme degree. TSA's efforts to advance these technologies may set the standard for other sectors. So TSA must go out of its way and take the time to do the things the right way. TSA seems to be in a hurry to fast forward into the future with these technologies, even as it allows vulnerabilities within existing identity verification process to persist. Last year, TSA notified Congress of security incidents that have occurred within the registered traveler program operated by CLEAR. The program has allowed some travelers to enter security checkpoints using fraudulent identity. In one instance, an individual picked up a boarding pass out of a trash can and was able to use it to go through screening because a CLEAR employee falsely told TSA they had verified the individual's identity. Addressing these vulnerabilities does not require any futuristic technology or creative solutions. It simply requires TSA to stop outsourcing identity verification functions to a corporation seeking to make profit. Vetting and verifying passenger identities are inherently governmental functions. For nearly a year, Ranking Member Thompson has been calling for TSA to require all passengers to go through TSA's own identity verification processes. TSA could mandate such a requirement today. I urge TSA to spend a little less time fast-forwarding into the future and instead focus on addressing security vulnerabilities that threaten the aviation system today. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these critical topics. And Chairman Jimenez, I thank you for our witnesses again, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ian Grossman serves as President and CEO of the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators. Jeremy Grant serves as the coordinator for the Better Identity Coalition. Hal Wiedinger serves as the Senior Vice President of Client Success at IDEMIA. And Jay Stanley serves as Senior Policy Analyst at the American Civil Liberties Union. I thank each of our witnesses for being here today, and I recognize Ian Grossman for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today and discuss this important issue of the future of identity management. The American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, or AMVA, is a nonprofit organization representing motor vehicle agencies and jurisdictional highway safety law enforcement. In plain speak, our association's primary members are the state DMVs and the state police throughout the U.S. and Canada. We enable collaboration to ensure safe drivers, safe vehicles, secure identities, all together to save lives. When first contemplated, driver's licenses were issued solely to indicate a person as having been granted the legal authority to operate a motor vehicle. Now, the driver's license has become the de facto primary identity document in the United States. It serves as a document of choice for public services, financial institutions, and other entities seeking identity assurance. Americans use their state driver's license or identification card in countless everyday activities, including making age-limited purchases, entering schools, visiting doctor's offices, and of course, boarding an airplane. This is why driver licensing agencies has become the foremost trusted authority in identifying whether people are who they claim to be. As we live through the age of digital transformation, rapidly evolving in the post-COVID world of touchless transactions, it comes as no surprise that your driver's license is being transitioned to an electronic format. This improvement is the mobile driver's license, or MDL. The MDL is the future of licensing and proof of identity. An MDL, the driver's license hosted on a mobile device with the capability of being updated in real time. It contains the same data used to produce a physical license. However, MDL data is securely transmitted to a relying party's reader. The MDL is a significant advancement over physical credentials, which can easily be lost or stolen, become damaged, become outdated as information changes, or offer too much information. Unlike a physical credential, which can easily be replicated by counterfeiters, the MDL offers a completely touchless transaction with selective information release, data protection, and so much more. The physical credential is limited by being a snapshot in time. The information it represents may change, but once produced, it cannot be updated until it is reissued. Reissuance typically occurs infrequently, sometimes only after many years. Additionally, with a physical credential, the person inspecting the credential may be forced to draw conclusions about the validity of the document based on a visual examination. By comparison, a relying party authenticating an MDL using a reader will immediately know that the MDL was issued by a bona fide issuing authority, it was issued to the person presenting it, and the data is no more than 90 years old. Currently, to have adequate inspection of a physical credential, a relying party has to have extensive knowledge of security features or have tools to confirm that the security features are included in the correct places on the credential. In the case of an MDL, the authentication process can happen seamlessly behind the scenes, so the relying party does not need to know what security features are part of the MDL. They only need to possess the public key. The encrypted public key, which is used to authenticate the MDL, and if authenticated, the data is transmitted and displayed to the relying party. Without the authentication, no data is sent, protecting the credential holder's data, and protecting the relying party from fraud. In the future, state driver licensing agencies will each publish their own public key. To support this, AMVA has developed a digital trust service to provide relying parties a trusted central site to obtain all issuing authorities' public key certificates. AMVA's primary focus has been developing international standards and supporting early adopters with the process of issuing MDLs. However, regular interaction with relying parties will be critical in the future of identity management and MDL proliferation. Educating and onboarding those who seek to access the data in the MDL must be prioritized. We urge Congress to consider investments critical to establishing these trust networks. This can include grant awards to states who invest in the foundational systems that support mobile driver's licenses, or the expansion of identity transaction architecture. I appreciate your time and the opportunity to testify. In the realm of digital identity administration, the primary goal of state licensing agencies remains the preservation of identity as integrity as a public good by continuing for the DMVs to be the most secure, trusted, privacy-preserving, and convenient source of that identity. Thank you again for the time today, the commitment to this conversation, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Grossman. I now recognize Jeremy Grant for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I'm here on behalf of the Better Identity Coalition, an organization that's focused on working with policymakers to improve the way that Americans can protect and verify their identities when they're online. Our members include leaders in sectors like financial services, health, technology, fintech, payments, and security. Our 26 members are united by a common recognition that the way we handle digital identity today in the U.S. is broken, and by a common desire to see both the public and private sectors each take steps to make identity systems work better. 5 years ago, we released a blueprint for policymakers on how to improve digital identity infrastructure in America. The blueprint highlighted the ways that government can play a role in delivering more secure, inclusive, privacy-preserving digital solutions by closing the gap between the nationally recognized authoritative credentials that we have here in the U.S. that work in the physical world, like driver's licenses, passports, and birth certificates, and the lack of any digital counterpart to those credentials that can be used when Americans need to prove who they are online. Digital driver's licenses, also known as mobile driver's licenses or MDLs, play a big role in the blueprint by virtue of the fact that driver's licenses and state ID cards are by far the photo ID that's most commonly obtained by people in the U.S. and are thus the documents that are most commonly used to prove one's identity today in the physical world. We're thrilled to see the subcommittee focusing on the issue of digital identity and what is needed beyond the Real ID Act. There's 5 key points we'd like to emphasize today. First, when it comes to mobile driver's licenses, the government's prioritizing the wrong use cases. There's essentially 2 core use cases for digital versions of state driver's licenses and digital ID cards. The first are in-person cases, such as clearing a TSA security checkpoint or proving age at a bar to buy alcohol. This is where you're presenting a digital version of the plastic card in your wallet that's instead stored on your phone. The second is remote or online use cases where you need to prove who you are online, say to open a bank account or apply for government services. Of these 2, the first is a nice to have, while the second addresses a critical cybersecurity priority, a wave of identity-related cybercrime that's impacting millions of Americans and costing us hundreds of billions of dollars each year. This has been documented by agencies like FinCEN and the GAO. Now, this is not to say there aren't some tangible benefits to the in-person use cases, but given what's happening in the online world, it's time we get our priorities straight. Second, our understanding is that the reason DHS and the states have been focused on the in-person use cases is because work is still ongoing in the International Standards Organization, known as ISO, to craft a standard for the online use cases of MDLs. This is a terrible reason for the government to avoid focusing on solving a problem that leads to hundreds of billions of dollars in identity-related cybercrime, most of it perpetrated by organized crime or hostile nation states. If ISO is moving too slowly, the U.S. should take the lead on creating its own standard and work to advance it in ISO, rather than sit back and hope that ISO eventually figures it out. Now, while DHS does not create standards typically, DHS, or even better, the White House or Congress, should request that NIST lead an effort to create the standards and guidance needed to accelerate the deployment of secure, privacy-protecting MDL apps that Americans can use to better protect and assert their identity online. There's actually a precedent for this here. There's a lot of ISO cybersecurity standards that are more or less based on work that NIST led first. Third, TSA alone should not be in the lead here, in that there's things that TSA is responsible for with regard to identity, but they're a relatively small subset of issues with regard to the broader set of issues that's at play. It's not TSA's mission to ensure a safe and privacy-preserving foundation for, say, digital transactions in banking or health or government services. And while I admire a lot of the work TSA is doing here, particularly how their team is taking some very forward-looking steps in their proposed draft regulations on MDLs to look ahead to maybe solving these other issues, there's just a bigger structural issue where TSA is going to be limited in what they can accomplish. This brings up my fourth point, which is that digital identity is critical infrastructure and needs to be treated as such. DHS said as much in 2019 when it declared identity as one of 55 national critical functions, defined as those services so vital to the U.S. that disruption, corruption, or dysfunction would have a debilitating impact on security. But compared to the other critical functions in that list, identity has gotten scant investment and attention. And it's a little puzzling that DHS, after calling out digital identity as a critical function, has then opted to focus so narrowly here as it implements the Real ID Modernization Act of 2020. Finally, on that note, the White House could and should play a bigger role here by launching a whole-of-government effort to address critical vulnerabilities in our digital identity fabric. President Biden actually had language on this in the March 2023 National Cybersecurity Strategy. There's a bipartisan bill. I know Congressman Foster will be here in a bit. He was a lead sponsor. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. Note that I have submitted some lengthier testimony for the record, as well as a copy of our policy blueprint, and I'll look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grant, and I recognize Hal Wiedeger for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Jimenez and Ranking Member Tanadar, for inviting me to this important topic to testify today. IDEMIA is on a mission to unlock the world and make it safer. IDEMIA provides unique technologies underpinned by long-standing expertise in biometrics, cryptography, data analytics, systems, and smart devices that secure billions of transactions. With 15,000 employees, IDEMIA is trusted by over 600 governmental organizations and more than 2,300 enterprises spread over 180 countries with an impactful, ethical, and socially responsible approach. For more than 60 years, IDEMIA has been a trusted partner of government agencies offering unmatched expertise in identity management. We have produced over 1 billion driver's licenses in the U.S. and currently produce driver's licenses for 34 states and mobile driver's licenses for 5 states. Additionally, the Transportation Security Administration relies on our credential authentication technology, CAT, to authenticate and verify and identify millions of travelers every day. Identity verification is a critical part of the security mission of TSA. Our CAT machine helps TSA validate a passenger's identity and provide real-time security data on a passenger's vetting status. The newest iteration of this technology will enable the use of digital IDs and facial match to further increase the security effectiveness of identity validation processes. As TSA implements the Real ID mandate, the CAT machine will also let the officer know if a Real ID is counterfeit. Digital identity solutions provide consumers with unlimited benefits. Digital IDs are here today and will be increasingly relied upon in the future. Driver's licenses, passports, and other credentials can be accessible on our mobile devices, much like your credit cards today. This innovation fundamentally changes the identity security market, enhancing security and improving the customer experience, providing consumers with ultimate control over their identity. Digital IDs are derived from physical ID, and the fidelity of the information is tied to how robust the initial proofing process for the physical ID was. For example, a customer with a Real ID compliant physical credential has proven both their identity and their legal presence in the U.S. A digital ID derived from a Real ID compliant physical credential provides the consumer with a digital document that enables them to verify both their identity and their legal presence in the U.S. Unlike a physical ID, which can be lost, used by an imposter, or presented even if it has been revoked, a digital ID can only be unlocked and used by the individual to whom it was issued if the issuer allows it to be accessed, significantly reducing opportunities for fraud and ensuring only you can authorize the use and validation of your identity information. The use cases for this innovative technology provide significant consumer benefits, making it easier for disaster victims to file claims, preventing fraudulent transactions, enabling customers with accessibility challenges to enroll for important services wherever they are, faster provisioning of public aid and services to citizens, or creating a frictionless experience for travelers. Consumer demand and convenience will force ID verification to be digital. Digital identity solutions are secure, enhance privacy, and meet robust global standards. Like many tools and technology advanced innovations, our technology is safe because we and our customers adhere to the highest ethical privacy and accuracy standards. We demonstrate our leadership and commitment by regularly taking part in tests by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, to check how our technology platforms and assess its accuracy to ensure it is safe, secure, and accurate. The test results confirm IDEMIA's long-standing expertise and demonstrate how advanced our technology is, giving us and our customers confidence that they are using proven technology that has been tested to ensure both accuracy and fairness. However, we also have a role to play in determining who we sell our technology to and how our technology is used. Any tool in the wrong hands can cause harm. We ensure that our customers are using our technology in a way that aligns with our values and makes it safe and easier for people to prove their identity in a secure manner that also enhances privacy protection. For society to unlock this potential, we need a legal and regulatory framework that ensures responsible use while also enabling and supporting continuous innovations and society benefits. In closing, we're grateful to work with the fantastic partners like the Department of Homeland Security, the Transportation Security Administration, the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, and advocacy groups like the Better Identity Coalition and the American Civil Liberties Union. Thank you for inviting IDEMIA to engage in this important discussion today. We look forward to your questions and appreciate an open dialogue to discuss digital identity solutions and the important benefits they provide to society.
Thanks, Mr. Riediger. I now recognize Mr. Stanley for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Chairman Jimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify today, and thank you for your attention to the emerging issues around digital IDs. Let me start by saying that our immediate concern is that the TSA is pushing ahead with a set of digital ID standards that aren't ready for prime time. If we are to have a digital ID system, it's vital that we take the time to do it right. The TSA proposes to incorporate into U.S. regulations an MDL standard set by the international standards body, the ISO. That standard, which allows for centralized tracking of how we use our IDs, was created behind closed doors by a secretive international committee made up of government agencies, tech giants, and for all we know, the Chinese and Russian governments. We don't know because when we asked the ISO for the list of who was in the group that wrote this standard, they refused to disclose it. And the standard is not even available to the public without paying thousands of dollars. That is no way to make policy in a democracy on something that will affect us all, as Mr. Grant said, will be a piece of our critical infrastructure. We are concerned that the TSA appears to be working extremely closely with one company, Apple, even for mysterious reasons, signing over to Apple the agency's patents governing the operation of its airport digital ID checkpoints. It's also unclear that the TSA has the authority for its proposed digital ID plans. And there are larger questions about why the TSA, with its relatively narrow mission, has been positioned to determine the shape of the nation's identity system. The TSA is pursuing an initiative not important to its mission, but that will have widespread spillover effects on American society. Let me flesh this out by making 3 overall points. First, a digital identity system would have far-reaching consequences. The idea might sound simple, but the creation of a digital ID, especially one that could be used over the internet, would be a turning point that could have enormously harmful effects. Once it starts to become easy to share your ID with the press of a button, the danger is that we start getting identity demands from all quarters. Want to enter a 7-Eleven? Scan your ID. Want to browse a clothing store? Scan your ID. Buy a cup of coffee, park your car, scan your ID. And if we get a digital ID that can be used online, we may wake up one day and find that if you want to watch a video or log on to social media or look at a news site, we get a demand to, quote, press a button and send us your driver's license. There is already far too much tracking that takes place of us online, and polls show that Americans are very uncomfortable with it. But that tracking is far from perfect. A digital ID could make it inescapable. And a digital ID system, if not built carefully, could send a report back to the government every time you show your ID, a record of every bar, club, casino, bank, and doctor's office visit. And once it goes online, every website and online service you use too. The ISO standard permits this. The second point I would like to make is that any digital ID system must come with safeguards. If we are to have a digital ID, on a technical level, the system should have privacy built in. And we need legal safeguards. For example, we need to make sure that police officers do not and cannot access our phones during ID checks. We need protections to make sure we aren't swamped by identification demands at every turn. We need to ensure that a digital ID remains optional. My third point is that we need to take the time to do this right. If we must have a digital ID system, we can design one that makes use of the newest innovations in technology to protect our privacy, while at the same time making legitimate ID requests easier and more secure. There's an enormous amount of innovation, invention, and discussion still underway around identity and encryption technologies, but there are still many missing pieces that need to be worked out. We're at a formative moment. It would be a pity to find ourselves locked in to a suboptimal standard, an ID system, the way we're stuck with our QWERTY keyboards, where the keys are intentionally placed to slow down typists because early typewriters jammed easily. There's no hurry here. Digital IDs are not going to speed people through airline security. ID checking is not the bottleneck, and it won't free people from having to carry their physical ID cards. The TSA warns on its website, quote, "You must still carry your physical ID." Nor is there any popular clamor for digital IDs from residents of the states. Those that have rolled out digital ID have not had substantial public sign-on, except where people have been forced to use them. Digital IDs are being driven by vendors and other corporations, not by any public excitement about the technology. So again, to summarize, my 3 points are that a digital identity system could have profound consequences, become a major piece of our public critical infrastructure, and it needs technological and legal safeguards, and we need to take the time to do this right. It's too big to leave to the nation's departments of motor vehicles. It's too big to leave to the TSA, and it will become a significant thing. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I want to make it very clear that I'm not here to advocate for digital anything. My issue is really the fact that we have a standard which is real ID in order to pass a TSA checkpoint, and that maybe 50% of the American public will not have real ID come May 7th of 2025. A digital ID doesn't solve the problem. Mr. Grossman, a digital motor driver's license is based on a driver's license issued by a state, yet only 5 states out of the 56 issuing jurisdictions that we have actually will only give you a real ID with the requirements of a real ID. So the other jurisdictions, you may get a real ID, or they may ask you to pay more to get a real ID, and that's up to the individual whether they want a real ID or not. At the end of the day, if it's not a real ID, even if it's a digital motor driver's license, it won't get you past TSA. And that's what this committee is about. Okay. So we can talk about some other issues. By the way, some of the issues you brought up, Mr. Stanley, are provocative. Actually, you know, starts me to think those are outside the purview of this committee. If TSA is in fact involved in that, then, you know, I think we need some further hearings on what is TSA doing to set standards for digital ID, and why is TSA the only government agency doing that? That's for another day. Today, I'm really thinking about what are we going to do on that day when you're trying to get into the airport and you have 2.9 million people going through airports, and 50% of them can't get on their plane because they don't have a real ID. So the push for digital IDs, is there any Mr. Grossman, maybe you can answer this question. Is there a push to convert all of that digital ID to real ID, or are we going to still have some people have real ID, some people don't have real ID?
So certainly in the current state, most states offer that option of you can either access a real ID or have a non-real ID compliant credential. And the focus of states right now are to continue to provide that option where they're providing it, and then working with TSA, for the ones that are Real ID compliant, is there a way to reflect that in the mobile device as well? That's the rulemaking that was referred to by other testimony. And so the state's focus as it relates to Real ID has always been following the federal guidelines. It said, if you want to use your state-issued driver's license or identity card for federal purposes, meet these standards. And that's why all states have provided the option for their constituents to receive that federally accepted credential.
Correct, but isn't it true that also some of these states or some of these jurisdictions will charge you more for that Real ID?
The fees certainly do vary across the states, that's correct.
Okay. I don't know if any of you can answer this, but I know that, what percentage of the American public actually has a passport? That's another way to get through, have a Real ID. Does anybody know the answer to what percentage of the American public actually has a passport?
I think it's a little less than half. Numbers surged a little bit after 9/11 when some of the land border points required some sort of an ID, but it's not something that's a viable alternative for, at least half the country.
All right, so there we go back to my original premise is that come that day on 2025, we will have utter chaos at our airports because a great number of people will not have the identification that is required by TSA in order to board a plane. And so what is it that we're going to do about it? Unfortunately, I don't think any of you really have the answer to that question. That's a question. Yes, Mr. Stanley.
I will say that the TSA has been threatening chaos in airports for the last 18 years. It has been its main hammer to try to get recalcitrant states into line. You may recall after Real ID was passed, it was enormously unpopular. Over half the states passed either resolutions against it or laws that banned their DMVs from complying. We were opposed to it. We worked with a lot of conservative allies in state legislatures to get these. And the TSA has consistently threatened that it's going to cause chaos in airports and forced state legislators to pull back on that opposition to Real ID. And the TSA is engaged in a game of chicken, and that I think it's highly unlikely that the TSA would actually make half the population of any state have to go through secondary screening at an airport because of the chaos that it would ensue. And I would not be, and each time they set a new deadline, we say to people, they will probably push this back, and they always have so far. And so I would be unsurprised if they don't push it back again.
But that would also take congressional action, right, to do that?
My understanding is no, because they never got congressional action the last 4 or 5 times they kept pushing the deadline back.
Fair enough, but if it's something that was mandated by Congress, I think that maybe it should take congressional action to push it back. And so maybe that's the reason why we're having this hearing, so that I can educate our colleagues that, hey, we have a problem looming, and that are we going to hope that TSA pushes it back, or are we going to do something about it? And then if we are going to do something about it, how can we fix this problem? Because this problem has been going on for a number of years, and do we continually kick the can down the road? The testimony that I've seen opens up a whole can of other worms. Okay, that maybe not this subcommittee will take up. But if TSA is actually involved in those activities, maybe this subcommittee will take them up. And so my time is up for right now, so I recognize the ranking member, gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanadar.
Again, thank you, Chairman Jimenez, for scheduling these hearings. This is important. I'm a scientist by training. I'm an innovator. I love technology and can't wait for my Christmas presents, hopefully with some good technology in the market. And as a scientist, I recognize we need to continue to innovate, improve our processes, make people's lives better. But the question here that I raise and the concerns I have about using technology before it is completely baked. I represent the Michigan's 13th Congressional District. represent the city of Detroit with 78% African American population. And we have seen use of facial technology, facial IDs. The police department has used some of that and seen some horror situations, people incorrectly identified, wrongly accused, using a technology that I'm not quite sure is appropriate or is been fully tested, that is, does not have biases and discrimination against people of color, for example. And so my concern here is, are we rushing this so much that, we are affecting people's privacy and rights and the potential, although the potential to enhance security and convenience, are those benefits may be outweighed by the risk they pose to privacy. And Mr. Stanley, what risk does facial recognition technology pose to privacy and people's civil liberties?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. The face recognition is a very, very powerful biometric. In many ways, it's the most powerful biometric. If somebody wants to take your fingerprint, they can't do it unless you know that you're doing it. Whereas if you're walking down the street, you can be subject to face recognition. And we have, given the enormous number of cameras in our society, if we were to plug face recognition to all of them, it would be basically, it could come close to the same as putting a GPS tracker on everybody. And that could reveal a lot of information about people. And so people in the privacy and civil liberties community have been rightly very wary of face recognition technology, and it's used before it's ready for prime time, which I thought you, as you said very well, before the biases are worked out, before procedures are worked out in police departments and the like. And we have called for a moratorium on its use by law enforcement until we can get all that straight. Face recognition also plays a role in the identity context, and that's a very complicated issue again. For example, every time you show a digital ID, does it transmit a digital photo of yourself to the person that is verifying you? And now they have your digital photo, or do you self-verify to your phone? There are a lot of very complex issues that need to be worked out around there, and I think that that is part of what makes the current digital identity technology immature.
Thank you. And Mr. Stanley and Mr. Grant, what recommendations do you have for TSA and the federal government for developing digital ID standards in a responsible manner?
Well, from my perspective, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I would get this. I think TSA deserves a seat at the table, but this is something that's much bigger than TSA, and that the issues we're trying to deal with, particularly with this wave of identity-related cybercrime that we've seen and sort of this new threats that are emerging there, both to the technical side, the security side, and also the privacy side that you're talking about. We have other parts of government that are quite good at this. And in fact, this is a place where it would be great to see NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, be directed to play a bigger role. I think one thing Jay and I agree on is that we need to get this right. I'm saying go fast, he's saying go slow. But at least from our perspective, let's get this to the experts, within the digital identity team at NIST, there's a privacy engineering team at NIST, give them a time-boxed deadline, say a year, to try and actually bring the right stakeholders together and get this figured out. We actually know how to do this. In fact, I'd say a lot of the technologies that perhaps we would have dreamed of a few years ago are now starting to become mature, and we know how to build robust and privacy-preserving digital identity systems. But tying this into real ID compliance, I think we're conflating two different objectives right here and not necessarily focusing on the right ones.
Thank you. Mr. Stanley, if you have time, but.
I would agree that TSA is not the right agency to lead. As I said in my comments, I would urge the TSA not to exert pressure on the states to move to build digital identities around the ISO standard, which is basically what they're doing. I would urge them to be very careful about working with particular vendors. at the end of the day, we need a system that is open and where an American who wants to participate in our identity system doesn't have to deal with any one company or small number of companies, but can deal with a whole variety of competitive companies. So those are two of the recommendations I would make.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for letting me go a little bit over my time.
It's fine. It's fine, Mr. Ranking Member. I'm pretty lax here. We don't have a big crowd. So I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Grant, I'd like to pick up just where Ranking Member Tanadar left off with you there. You mentioned in your written testimony that Congress passed the Real ID modernization in 2020, but did not give TSA direction on what use cases should be a priority. So I'd like to hear a bit more about whether you believe Congress should give TSA a directive to prioritize the online identity use cases, or rather give a separate entity the authority to be prioritizing, like NIST, the authority to be prioritizing and the direction to prioritize these types of cases?
Thanks for the question. So I'd like to see NIST more involved. I also think one of the things that was interesting is when the original Real ID Act was passed in 2005, DHS in general was given direction to figure out the standards and the regulations. And it was led out of their policy office at the time. When the Modernization Act was passed in 2020, which essentially said a Real ID could either be a plastic card or it could be digital, the assumption was that the same team in DHS might lead it again, but then TSA was basically given the authority. Jurisdictionally, this becomes a bit of a tricky issue, but there is certainly, as I talk about the cybersecurity implications of digital identity writ large and the way that mobile driver's license could play a role in solving those problems, one of the thoughts has been that CISA could potentially play a role, but CISA does not seem to be engaged on this particular issue. I don't know that CISA would be ideal necessarily. I would personally prefer to see this at NIST, but even within the scope of DHS and the current legislation that we have, DHS has the ability to bring in a cybersecurity set of experts as opposed to just TSA with its more limited focus.
And Mr. Grossman, I would like to go back to your testimony about MDLs. I believe you described that they could offer better security and better privacy for consumers if they're designed properly. I'd like to hear more from you about what are the elements of that proper design that could ensure the security and the privacy.
So there's a number of elements that are laid out both in the standard as well as the AMVA implementation guidelines, and a couple that I'll highlight for an example. One is to not track where it is being used. So when someone uses it and it's red, that is not what we call calling home, phoning home back to the state agency. State agency doesn't know where and how you're using it. Making sure the protocols and policies are in place is a key protection. Another key protection of the mobile driver's license is you as the holder can decide what elements of my information am I going to share with this individual. By contrast, right now, if you think about every time you use your driver's license or identity card, you're physically handing it over to that person who may only need to know you're older than 21. And yet you're giving them your name, your address, information about you, whether or not you're an organ donor, the list goes on and on and on. Whereas you only need to know, I am old enough to make this purchase. And so the ability for, as an individual, to say, I'm only going to give you what you need, nothing more and nothing less, is the opportunity to protect that information.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Grant, back to you. One of the things that you mentioned was attributing the lack of progress at DHS to their desire to wait on the International Standards Organization to develop standards. We've touched on CISA, NIST. Can you elaborate on the advantages of DHS not waiting for the International Standards Organization to finish their work, both in terms of immediately protecting millions of victims from identity theft, in addition to wanting to remain the world leader in the digital identification space?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I'll preface this by saying that I mentioned this in my written testimony. I used to work at NIST. I used to lead digital identity efforts there from 2011 to 2015. Generally speaking, the voluntary consensus-based standards process that we embrace, along with a lot of our peers across the globe, is the best way to go. Every now and then, we have a bit of a crisis where we need to move a little quicker. And that's where I can think of at least two situations over the last 20 years where the White House or Congress have turned to NIST and said, you've only got 9 months, 12 months, and you've got to act. The first was in 2004 when President Bush issued Homeland Security Presidential Directive 12 in response to the need to have stronger ID for government workers and contractors. That was a presidential directive. NIST produced FIPS Federal Information Processing Standard, FIPS 201, within 9 months. The second was in the Obama administration when Congress deadlocked on cybersecurity legislation. And so they said, well, let's at least come up with a cybersecurity framework that can be voluntary, that not only government agencies, but also industry can start to use to manage cybersecurity risk. There was an executive order in February of 2013. A year later, because NIST only had a year, they rolled out the CSF. In fact, that's become the basis of an ISO standard today. I think we're at a moment right now with FinCEN's documented $212 billion in suspicious activity reports in 2021 tied to compromised identity. The GAO said between 100 and 135 billion in pandemic unemployment benefits lost to fraudsters, again, mostly organized criminals and hostile nation states. You add those numbers up, that's between 300 and 350 billion just in 2 sectors, just in 1 year. We can't afford to wait, and I think this is why we're at a point where we should stop deferring to ISO and hoping that the voluntary standards process works, and instead we basically put NIST, and really, I think we need a broader whole of government effort to address what I really think is a crisis right now when it comes to identity-related cybercrime.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Chair, for waving me on to this. It really, we've been wrestling with this and, for some years now, and it's, we're forced to sort of spread our effort into multiple committees and multiple agencies, and that slowed things down. I had a Zoom earlier this morning with the gentleman, Norbert Saggester, who is leading the EU effort on this, and they're making impressive progress. Their goals are that by, I think, February, they will have passed the enabling legislation, and that by sometime around 2026 or 27, every EU citizen will have who wants one, will be able to get a secure digital ID that they can present online to prove they are who they say they are. And they are wrestling with the same things that we have, where the states are going to be holding the biometrics and a lot of the key databases which people are comfortable with. And yet you need something which interoperates and prevents synthetic identity fraud and things like that. And so they are really doing the same, going through the same things we are, and it seems to me like maybe a year ahead, which is sort of ironic because their biggest collaborator is NIST, because all the standards that they're rolling out were actually developed at NIST years ago, and they still consult with NIST. They're very eager also to collaborate with the United States, which I thought was very interesting, that they repeatedly approached me with the idea that we should be, the free democracies of the world should be working together on this, because we are that's where you want to draw the fence on these efforts. And so actually, Mr. Grant, could you say a little bit about your perception of what the rest of the world is doing compared to the U.S.?
Thank you, Congressman Foster, and thanks for your leadership on this issue. We're at an interesting inflection point. I'm going to digress for about 15 seconds to say, back in 2011, when I first joined NIST, I learned that when it came to payment cards, the U.S. had 25% of the transactions, but 50% of the fraud. In other words, an 8 times higher fraud rate, because we were the only country who had not migrated away from insecure magnetic stripes to more secure chip-based smart cards. And it was only after the Target breach happened in 2013 where we had so much damage that finally the banks and retailers and other stakeholders said, we need to start to move toward the rest of the world so we can erase all of this massive crime that we're seeing tied to our reliance on insecure technology. I think we're at an inflection point right now when it comes to identity, where we are seeing all of our peers across the globe, be it the European Union, the UK, Canada, Australia, Singapore, other countries that we tend to think of as our, often competitors, but also peers. Every one of them has a strategy right now to try and address this issue of digital identity online. And the US is the only country that has no strategy whatsoever. And so I worry that in a few years, from both an economic competitiveness standpoint, along with the security losses that we're suffering because of identity-related cybercrime, compared to the rest of the world, we're going to be in somewhat of a dark place.
Yeah, and you didn't mention India, which is making really, they came up with a basic identity, mandatory identity program for every Indian. There are lots of things that Americans would not be comfortable about their system, but after having established that, There is an incredible ecosystem of financial innovation that's come into being based on the ability to prove you are who you say you are online. When you get past that hurdle, then the startup costs for fintechs are much smaller. There's a lot of enthusiasm, particularly among smaller banks, where one of their biggest costs is the cost of onboarding customers. If you remember during COVID, when we had to bring a lot of unbanked individuals into the system, it was costing $400 to bring an unbanked person in. And in India, it's essentially free. You just get out your cell phone, prove you are who you say you are, consult the list of bad actors, and if you're not on it, boom, you've opened your bank account. And that is, that's an impressive step forward, and other countries are noticing it, and it's in the process of being adopted. The Indian system and their payment rails are being adopted by, Singapore and Indonesia and the Philippines and so on, and as well as some of the Gulf states. So, there's a danger that usually we spend a lot of time worrying that the Chinese currency is going to take over for the US dollar, but I think there's a more real worry that the payment rails that were developed in India based on a secure digital ID will take over. And so we have competitive worries to look at on that. And so the other thing that I guess has been mentioned and talked about is the business of AI deepfakes, which are really frightening. And all the banks I serve on financial services, the banks are all terrified by this because they use voice recognition. And when people say, what can Congress do about deepfake and what AI generally, the number one thing that we could do today is to have federal recognition of mobile ID online to prevent people from being impersonated from this. And that should be a bipartisan thing that we can really move the ball forward on this time. So thank you again for letting me participate in this, and thank you to our witnesses.
Quite welcome. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our panelists for being here today. Mr. Stanley, having been on the other side during the course of my life, of many interactions with the ACLU, I look forward to us agreeing to something today. It would be a first in history. So I say that lightheartedly because we are a free nation, and generally speaking, the purpose of this committee is to maintain the security of our homeland, but the security of our homeland is to be maintained without sacrificing individual rights and freedoms of our citizenry, or else what's the purpose of the security of the homeland? So this hearing touches on a subject matter that is reflective of that need for balance. In my state of Louisiana, we were one of the first to push through our state legislature digital identification as official through the state, recognized by the state. So as a cop, if I interact with you and I ask for your ID, for your driver's license, you can show me your phone. And there's an official app on the phone that's recognized by the state that I can look at your documentation there. So retail stores and state government offices and police officers, recognize this digital ID, but TSA does not. So a common question that, conservative Republican like me, we hear back home is why we have 9-10 million illegals coming across the border and I can't use my digital ID to get on an airplane. But these guys get tickets from Department of Homeland Security, and we pay to send them wherever they want to go in the country, and that's sort of a generalization of what's happening, but it's very accurate. It's pretty much true. So, Mr. Grossman and Mr. Grant, could you speak to what are the benefits of the expansion of official digital IDs as it relates to both enhanced security and protected individual rights and freedoms, which is a part, Mr. Stanley, I'm going to hope we can agree on. Mr. Grossman and Mr. Grant.
Well, it's a great question. I'll say with regard first to Louisiana's mobile driver's license. Louisiana's definitely been an innovator here. It was one of the first states out of the gate. And I will say with the draft regulations that TSA's put forward on MDLs, if the Louisiana ID or any other state ID that's gone forward on the mobile driver's license side meets those rules, they would be able to use that to board a plane. That's my understanding, at least. Although I'll let TSA tell you that authoritatively. I think the balance between security and privacy is an important one. And where, as somebody who's I've generally been a privacy advocate.
Between security and freedoms.
Freedoms, yes.
Yes, sir.
I think we can give people more privacy than they have today by architecting these solutions the right way. In that, for example, if I hand my ID over at a bar, you can read everything about me when what you only need to know is that I'm over 21. I don't get that question a lot these days, but there was a time when it mattered. Digitally, I can just share one attribute about me. Same with trying to do something online. Everything that's on my driver's license might not be needed to be shared with the bank or with the fintech app that I'm trying to apply for an account with, but they can get those validated details about me that they need directly from the authoritative source, rather than relying on some other solutions that are looking at other sources to try and guess if it's you or not. So I do think that, again, with the proper design, and this is why we're really calling for sort of a whole.
So if the digital designs in interest of time would comply with, say, Real ID, then you would see a path forward for not just for Louisiana, but every sovereign state to be able to allow the citizenry the option of using a hard ID versus a digital ID?
That's underway already.
Yes, sir. Mr. Grossman, you concur?
Yeah, I would concur, and I would add the reason why states are going down the road of mobile driver's licenses, as fascinating and exciting as new technology is, the core driving purpose is where does this technology allow us to improve on safety, security, freedom from the physical world.
Right.
And so through all these testimonies, through the privacy, through the security, through getting it right, it all has to be with that driving purpose of making it better than the status quo of the physical world.
So, Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but I would ask the indulgence of the chair to allow Mr. Stanley to agree or disagree. It'd be a historical moment.
Yeah, let's go right ahead, Mr. Stanley. Let's make some history here.
I thoroughly agree with you that it is.
That's it, I'm out.
That it is vital to keep an eye on freedom, even as we look at what a digital ID can.
Thank you, Mr. Stanley, and I appreciate the indulgence, Mr. Chair.
All right, we have some time for a second round, and so I'll start with myself. Mr. Grossman, we're talking a lot about the digital world and all, and digital IDs, but digital IDs are going to be based on a standard, just like a hard copy ID right now is. And so, while states may be offering digital IDs, there's no guarantee that they will be real ID. They may not be real ID. So that is not going to be as secure as real ID. Or do you think that a state-issued non-real ID, driver's license is as secure as a real ID, that individual in fact is who they say they are?
Fundamentally, yes. And this is because states, even before 9/11, even before the Real ID Act, states were already recognizing the challenges of the vetting, identity, and credentialing process and making significant changes and investments to producing a more secure credential and a more secure vetting process to make sure someone is who they say they are. And all credentials that US DMVs issued, there is a enormously high level of confidence that that person is who they say they are. It is fundamental to their mission and is something that they provide a high level of insurance regardless of the type of credential they're carrying.
So what's the difference between a non-real ID and a real ID issued by a state?
So there are certain steps in documentation that the Department of Homeland Security has identified as we would like states to follow these steps to meet the Real ID requirements in order to use the state driver's licenses for federal purposes. The non-Real ID credentials in the states that offer it we would have to provide you a list by state. Some are very close to the Real ID process, and some have different gaps in between the Real ID process and the non-Real ID process.
Would it be easier for somebody to go into a state and say, I'm Mr. Grossman, and you may be Mr. Grossman, but then Mr. Stanley may go and say, I'm Mr. Grossman, and get a driver's license that says that actually that he's Mr. Grossman?
That is,
If it weren't a real ID, which is easier to do? If it's not real ID, would it be easier for Mr. Stanley to become Mr. Grossman, or vice versa? Which is the more secure?
that would be, I can't answer that question of which one is more secure, because our states are dedicated to making sure they're both secure. The fundamental challenge of someone coming in and claiming to be someone else is something DMVs are battling every single day. And that's why they're using every tool in the toolbox to fight that fraud, to stop that fraud, regardless of which type of credential someone is trying to get.
Okay, now my question, Mr. Stanley, why are states fighting the standards for real ID?
Largely, the states have given up that battle. I think that a lot of Real ID was about strengthening the security protections, physical security protections on physical IDs, and that ship has basically sailed. Today's digital IDs are much more physically secure, as Mr. Grossman said, than they were before 9/11. That was going to happen anyway, probably.
I'm not talking digital ID, I'm talking real ID versus non-real ID. And because the majority of the jurisdictions, they do not issue just solely real ID. They issue real IDs, but they also give you an option not to get a real ID, the majority of the jurisdictions. So why are states not just saying everybody's going to get a real ID in order to get a driver's license?
I don't know exactly what a lot of the thinking is, but generally the objections to Real ID is that it is a huge unfunded mandate from the federal government that imposed a lot of very particular regulations on exactly how the DMVs did their business. Real ID was rammed through without hearings, without consulting with the DMVs and the experts in the DMVs of exactly how they should proceed. And that led to a lot of the objections, in addition to objections of people who saw it as a national identity system. And I think that, the answer of like, what is a real ID? It's whatever Homeland Security says it is. Under the regulation, under the law, they get to make up the regulations for what it is. And the same thing will apply to digital ID, which is what the concern about digital ID is that we're leaving it up to Homeland Security, and specifically they delegate it to TSA to decide for the whole nation what is and is not a Real ID compliant.
And what the standards are to get that digital ID? That's being left up to TSA and Homeland Security?
Correct.
Okay. I understand the issue now. All right, thank you. My time is up. I now recognize the ranking member.
Chairman, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Back to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Whittaker, am I pronouncing your name correctly? Whittaker? Mr. Whittaker, IDEMIA is rolling out the Cat 2 technology, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so one of the airports where that's being deployed is New Orleans. I anticipate, of course, it'll be well received, reflective of the training that our TSA agents and the clear personnel, the airline personnel, the staff on the ground there interact with the general public. Have you had pushback in any of your deployments that this committee should be aware of?
We've had no.
That's notable.
We've had no pushback. TSA plans the activity closely with all the jurisdiction, all the airports that are gaining Cat 2s. Our teams go out and deploy them. There have not been issues that have arisen in the deployment of the assets. They've generally been very well received.
And if there's an update on the boarding pass, like in the absence of a boarding pass, which is one of the ways that this new technology can function, am I correct? Is to coordinate the ID as presented and scanned with with the records for the airline regard, so a person would not have to have their boarding pass. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so that means that the technology would have some record of a boarding pass. Is that correct?
So
In the absence of the traveler presenting a boarding pass, if you're saying that the technology will locate and confirm the boarding pass that's associated with the ID that's been presented and scanned and compared with the image of the person that's standing before it, then you're saying that the technology has possession of the boarding pass data for that individual, correct?
in essence, that's correct. The platform is updated by TSA through their software backend processes.
Okay, so what if there's a variance of what the traveler believes is their accurate boarding data? They've upgraded or something like that, or if they've arranged to have seats adjoining with their traveling companion or something like that. Like, how fast is the technology updated from the airlines?
I apologize, I don't have an answer for that. TSA controls that part. We don't do that piece. As it relates to the boarding data, as it relates to their seats and the assignments, I don't believe that's a conversation at the TSA checkpoint, but I'd have to defer to TSA on that.
So it's just something we have to watch.
I'm sorry?
It's just something we'll have to watch.
Generally, my understanding, based on the airline processing, is that's handled by the airline. So what TSA gets is the flight manifest to know that you're
Right, but that's the boarding pass.
correct. Correct.
So you see what I'm saying? There's an intersection there between the new technology and the traveler and the airline and as it relates to the details of the boarding pass. We don't want to get in the weeds there. So the gentleman, my colleague, brought up AI. Do any of you have concerns in my remaining minute here? I mean, TSA is not using AI, but it's certainly, at least not on the front line where there's intersections. I'm not saying there's no research being done, but at the point of intersection with American citizens, TSA is not using AI. Do you see it as an issue and a challenge, and if so, how and why? Because we certainly see it as an issue.
I think the threat from AI when it comes to identity will probably be less acute in person and more online, where we're seeing cheap deepfakes. I can get 15 seconds of your voice or a photo of you, and suddenly you're online saying something you've never said before, never recorded before. I think this is going to be the new frontier in attacks in the cyber world, where particularly, I mentioned before, it's a bit of an anomaly when we see a big breach in identity that does not provide the attack vector. I think that might be about to explode if we don't have the right defenses in place to be able to block some of those. But I think this is actually an area where I think mobile driver's licenses, because they're rooted in public key cryptography that can't be spoofed by AI, are going to be really important in the cyber world. The in-person world, my personal view is that that's less of a threat.
Yeah, we certainly have to build guardrails in everything we do as we look at the emerging technologies of AI. I apologize, my time has expired, gentlemen, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So that video I saw of you praising the former president, that wasn't you, huh? Okay. I recognize the member from Illinois, Mr. Foster.
Thank you. I appreciate it again. Could you return a little bit to the phone home problem? Because this morning I had a long discussion with the EU representative, because the worry that I understand is that if every time you present your mobile ID, there's a query made to the database to say, is this the database maintainer, is this really valid or not? Then, which is a sort of innocuous thing, until you realize that means they have a record of every time you presented it and potentially even where you were when you presented it. And they believe, the EU believes that they have technological solutions that will make that not a worry. And Mr. Stanley, you're on the leading edge of this. Do you believe that that is something, if you pay attention to the rules under which you can demand a mobile ID, maybe even license, you make the collection of data from the mobile ID a licensable activity, which I think is the EU approach, whether this can actually be made into something that isn't really a privacy concern?
Yeah, I mean, we have definitely called for offline only, verifications so that the verifier is not phoning home, because as you said, it creates a record, it gives a record to the DMV or whatever, their vendor or whoever of everywhere that you showed your ID. And instead, they can just pre-download the public key of the DMV and use the public key to verify that your digital token is was signed by the DMV, and B, has not been altered by even one bit. And that solves that side of the tracking problem. There are other tracking problems with...
There's also a revocation problem, that if you say, there's the proof that I live in Naperville, Illinois, whereas I've in fact moved 2 months ago, at some point you have to consult a database. And I have been told that there are ways to publish the revocation list in a way that's encrypted, so that the questioner can just sit there and ask a question of the encrypted database, and whoever's maintaining it won't even know which individual is being asked about. And so I was just wondering if that is ready for prime time technology that could actually pretty much make this a non-issue.
So number one, that's a question for a cryptographer, but my general understanding is that, yes, with new technologies such as zero-knowledge proofs, you can prove that you know something without revealing what it is that you know, and there's currently a lot of exciting research and applications of these new cryptographic techniques that's being explored by cryptographers and others, and this is part of the reason why we're saying, let's take our time and do this right. Let's make use of those technologies. If they exist, it would be a pity if TSA and DMVs barrel ahead with this somewhat privacy protective, on privacy protective terms, primitive ISO standard, rather than taking the time and working in these kinds of technologies that the EU is looking at and so forth, so that we can, to some degree, have our cake and eat it too here, have the advantages that come from high technology, but protect our privacy at the same time.
Yeah, and it's really highlights the difference between the in-use case. If you're getting on an airplane, the government knows you're getting on the airplane. There isn't an issue of phoning home there. But if you're buying something online, maybe the government shouldn't know that you presented your mobile ID for that purpose. And so, it's really encouraging. I've been told by some cryptography types that this is actually a semi-solved problem at this point. And the EU is trying to get that. Well, we'll find out in February, I guess, when they roll out their official technical specifications and so on. Do you have any other comments on the whole concept of having collection of information a licensed activity? So that, if you decide, okay, I'm holding a rock concert, I'm worried about terrorists sneaking in, and so for 24 hours afterwards, I want to maintain a record of who walked through the turnstile, maybe that's okay, as long as you get a license for collecting that information from everyone who walked in, and if there's no terrorist event in 24 hours, you have, the terms of your license makes you destroy that kind of information. Is that this sort of thing that is contemplated in the U.S.?
I know that the EU is looking at that approach. In many ways, it seems like a characteristically European approach to things. And we don't have an opinion on whether that's the best way to impose limits, but we do think that one way or another, we need to make sure, because the fact that a digital ID makes it much easier and cheaper for a bank to know who you are. They don't have to go through these kludgy face recognition things and exploring databases to see if you can answer questions. It makes it much easier and cheaper for banks to know who you are, but that means it makes it cheaper and ever for everybody else as well. And so everybody's going to start asking you for your ID. And we have to pay attention to that flip side. And so whether it's by putting in place laws that restrict who can ask for an ID and when, or a licensing scheme like that, we haven't thought deeply enough about that. We don't have a position on that, but one way or another, it's the right goal.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And from what I understand, one of the things that are actually at risk with AI is encryption and cryptology. And so we put too many eggs in that basket. That's a subject that's a subject for another hearing, which, by the way, I think we're going to have a couple of more hearings. This hearing actually is going to lead to more hearings. One with TSA about what's going to happen on May 7th, 2025 specifically, and then what are they doing as far as digital IDs themselves and their role in it. So with that, I want to thank the witnesses for the valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.